Okay, it's officially 2:30 p.m. Eastern, so I think we'll get started, and welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining our webinar. Today we have Dr. Michael Babyak presenting Statistical Analysis in Clinical Trials, Current Best Practices. And just a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are muted and video cannot be turned on. We also ask that you please use the Q&A feature to type in your questions. And if you have any technical questions, like if you're having trouble hearing, please use the chat and I'll do my best to help. Please share your questions and comments at any time, and we'll answer all questions in the last 20 minutes of today's webinar. On today's panel, we also have Dr. Christine Ritchie, co-chair of the PCRC and representing the PCRC's Executive Committee. So I'd like to get started and ask Dr. Ritchie to please introduce our speaker.
Wonderful. Greetings, everyone. And I can't tell you how delighted I am today to introduce to you Dr. Mike Babyak, who is professor of medical psychology at Duke University Medical Center. And what's wonderful about Dr. Babyak is his varied and illustrious career that started with him serving as a registered nurse in hospital and home settings, then receiving a master's of arts in experimental psychology, and then a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kansas in 1995. He used those skills to then become very methodologically sophisticated and started gaining lots of experience in study design, multivariate statistics, and modeling in general, and has served as a statistician or a co-investigator on a lot of different investigations and studies, including a lot of biobehavioral interventions. He's been a friend of the Palliative Care Research Center for many years and has been an important faculty member in our clinical trials intensive. And we can't tell you how delighted we are to have him here to talk to us about best practices in statistical analysis in clinical trials. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Christine. It's always a pleasure to be involved with the PCRC. I'm going to talk today. I picked the title Best Practices, Best Current Practices, to emphasize that what we do in terms of analysis of clinical trials is an evolving phenomenon. We learn more every day. There are so many people out there working now on what the best practices are. Go to the next slide. And as a way of preface, it occurred to me it might be good to just quickly explain how we know this stuff. Next slide. So of course, for almost at least several centuries really, but especially in the last century and a half, we've had the theoretical statisticians like Fisher. This is actually some scribble from one of Fisher's notebooks. He was working out, I think, RH factor, not really statistical, but it was Fisher again doodling. So we had theory that helped us understand how to do inferential tests and that sort of thing. But in the last 20 years, next slide, in the last 20 years or so, with computing power becoming much more powerful and cheap, we've actually developed a literature unto itself of statistical experiments, and these involve, you maybe have heard of Monte Carlo simulations or Monte Carlo studies. And basically, this is just a quick schematic of how it works. We pre-specify what the quote unquote truth is in the computer. We create a population or certain properties like a correlation coefficient or something like that, where those are true. And then we pretend to be, 10,000 or 100,000 researchers who go in and take a sample of a given size and then put these through, some of our algorithms or our favorite tests, and then we evaluate how it works out overall. So there's this is now actual evidence-based along with theory, of course. So that's how we know things. Next slide. And so as we go along, we come up with what we think are best practices, and then someone will do an experiment or a set of experiments and find out, well, maybe this was better. And so we, like this Sudoku little puzzle shows there are a lot of corrections along the way. But next slide. Eventually, at some point, we can probably at this point, we could probably identify some core best practices. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to just try to, obviously, this is a, at least several courses worth, we're going to try and just hit on highlights here of things that in my experience as a consultant and as a co-investigator, a biostat person on a lot of grants, these are the things that I think tend not to be as well understood. So next slide. Okay, let's just start. One thing about my slides, I broke some rules here. They're probably a little busier than is usually recommended, but I know these slides will be available for people. And I also, have sort of done these to be available as references, reference material. And so you can see here are the things that I think are really important in terms of being good resources. And, I'll back up a minute, this is, statistics is a sort of odd duck in that it's one of the few fields I know of in medicine or science in general, where sometimes people who've taken 2 courses in grad school feel competent to do statistical analysis. And I think nowadays, things have become so sophisticated and specialized. I really recommend, even though you may be able to do some preliminary analyses, if you're not if you don't really have a lot of experience as a statistician, I would really recommend working with a bona fide statistician on all of your projects. And my presentation is at a minimum is to try and help you be good colleagues, good collaborators with a statistician. These best friends, the Pocock series in JAC a few years ago was really a great way. It was lucky it came out just as I was starting to do these talks for the PCRC. And it's a wonderful introduction to the most current thinking and consensus on a lot of the statistical issues. The SEND text is also really terrific. That is really the kind of granddaddy of all references, even though it's for drug development. It handles anything you could think of in a clinical trial, protocol violations, dropouts, randomization, blinding, all those sorts of things. We should all be familiar with the consort statement. There's also the ICH, the E9 statistical principles, even though they haven't been updated recently, they're still useful. And then Frank Harrell's manuscript checklist, and I'll mention Frank quite a bit in this talk. I see him as a real leader in the field in general of statistical analysis in medicine. Next slide. So here is, excuse me one second. So here is a graphic from one of the Pocock papers. And I would say that if all you understood out of this talk, or in general going forward, if you understood the principles here, these best practices, you'd be going a long way. You'd be in really good shape in terms of being a good collaborator and understanding what the modern standards are. I'm not going to go through these in any real detail here on this particular slide, but I will try to expand on some of them. I just want to run through a few here. So the first thing we do is we prepare an SAP, a statistical analysis plan. And there are so many advantages to that. It's really important nowadays to have that as a document. You give priority to the primary endpoint. The other highlight here is in the second column, the first heading, adjust for variables affecting prognosis. And we'll talk a little bit about that and why adjusted models now are considered, should be considered to be the primary model, adjusted meaning having covariates. And then really the only other thing I'd focus on here at this point is my favorite one. It's over there on the far right. It's the third bullet, anticipate regression to the truth. And that is really saying that even if your study is fantastic, wonderful methodology, and you hit all your recruitment marks and it's adequately powered, it's still just one study in a cumulative or an accumulation of evidence. And so, it's good to be happy about what you found, but we know it's also been very difficult to replicate findings. Next slide. Okay, so some basic principles of best practices. It doesn't always occur to everybody, but using best practices, just like you would use best practices in surgery or diagnosis, using best statistical practices is also an ethical obligation. We take public money, that's, on good faith from the people that provide that money that we're going to do the right thing. We also have an agreement with the people who volunteer for our studies, who decide, who participate, that we're going to do the best possible thing with our data. So there's a strong ethical obligation, and it's really an ethical breach not to use best practices. Beyond that, you want to involve the statistician very early, right away. In fact, when you have an idea about what you might want to do, sit down with a statistician, or at least communicate by email with some ideas and get a sense of where you stand. We also want to use the simplest sufficient statistic. There was a American Psychological about 20 or so years ago. The APA had a task force that was trying to improve statistical practice. And one of the things that stood out to me, this was at a time when everybody was very, very interested in, structural equation models and mixed models and all sorts of very, kind of highfalutin, complicated models. Now, those may be a good choice if they meet the question, if they can answer the question. But you should always try to find the simplest sufficient analysis. And that's in part because a big part of our job is communicating our findings to lay people, to policymakers. And so if a t-test can do what a structural equation model also could do, I'd pick the t-test and just try to explain it with some simple graphs. Also nowadays, there's a huge emphasis on the pre-specification of all the elements in your analysis. We want to have documented, we want to have everything written in a document that, here's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'll show you a few slides from now, some of the ramifications of that. We want transparency and 100% reproducibility. Now, reproducibility is different from replication. Being able to reproduce a study means that if you give someone else your data, they're going to find exactly what you found, given how you approached the analysis. Another principle, of course, is, and this is a no-brainer, obviously, ensure quality. I'd say, especially when I do consulting with other groups who may not have a statistician on board, 85 to 90% of the job is making sure the data are correct and clean. And there are all sorts of ways you can ensure that through things like REDCap with checks and that sort of thing. But it's really important. And then again, this is the same thing in the Pocock slide. Sober interpretation you ain't all that. You did a great job, but there's lots more to come in terms of whether anything stands up. Next. As I said, call the statistician early, call it often. These are just two of my favorite quotes. One by Fisher from way back. Call the statistician after the experiment is done. May be no more than asking him to perform a post-mortem examination. He may be able to say what the experiment died of. And then John Tukey, who had just a wonderful sense of humor. A combination of some data and an aching desire for an answer does not ensure that a reasonable answer can be extracted from a given body of data. Next slide. Okay, so we'll start with the statistical analysis plan. So now you've met with your statistician, you've kind of mapped out, in general what you're going to do. Now it's time to get the specifics down. And the great thing about a statistical analysis plan for everybody is once it's down, it's there for everyone to see. It's a roadmap for me as the statistician. I don't have to ask questions or have people make decisions, especially after we've seen the data. It prevents fiddling. It prevents things like switching endpoints because one looks better than another. This is all, pre-specified now. And I will say that, when you go to a good journal now, one of the first things they do will look at your paper, and then they'll go to your SAP that you filed, your protocol that you filed with the sponsor, and they'll see how well it maps. And if it doesn't map, they may say, oh yeah, sorry, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. Now it's okay to change that SAP along the line as long as you haven't seen the data. And so long as you have reported that change and okayed it with all the important stakeholders, the IRB, the sponsor, people on your team. So we always want to be transparent and make sure that there are no sort of hidden changes. Next. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so what's actually in the SAP? Well, of course, your hypotheses, your study design, parallel groups, step wedge. You're going to talk about how you're going to do sampling and randomization, how blinding is going to occur, who's in the final data set. Now, ideally, as I'll say in a minute, I'll talk about intent to treat. Usually it's intent to treat, but there are some modifications that some people find acceptable, again, provided it's pre-specified. You say what your primary and secondary endpoints. You may have some exploratory endpoints. Those are all pre-specified. I love as a reviewer, and again, as someone who has to actually do the analysis, I love seeing the actual model. Even, the Greek, even if it's just a simple, this endpoint equals this regression coefficient times this predictor plus this, plus this, plus this. I really think it helps to see that way. I don't have to parse through a bunch of sentences in English that may or may not convey exactly what the model is. You tell people how you're going to manage missingness, dropout, protocol violations, what's going to be done statistically. This is a sticky one. I said these are all consensus. This one, there's less consensus on. I have some thoughts on it, but should you adjust for multiple tests? And we'll talk about that in a second. You include power and how you came up with what your assumptions were in specific. And in my experience is that most power analyses are optimistic and often unrealistic. And so as painful as it can be to see what kind of power you really have, how many subjects it really takes to have adequate power. It's better to have adequate power than to imagine that it will just somehow magically happen. And then finally, in the SAP, you want to include the shell of a report. This can include empty tables, and, kind of figures, this is what figure one might look like with some fake means in there. So everything's ready to roll. We just do the analysis and we fill in those plots and tables. Next. Naomi, it occurs to me, I don't have anywhere in my room a clock. So if you could occasionally just put in the chat what time we're at every 15 minutes or so, I'd appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Okay, so who's in the analysis set? As I said, you should pre-specify it. You want to keep the assignment blinded till the end in terms of treatment assignment. You lock the clean data set, and the best practice is intent to treat. Perfect, thanks. So best practice, intent to treat, and this is because it fully exploits randomization. Intent to treat means that anybody who was randomized, even if they didn't participate a lick in the intervention, they end up going into the analysis. It estimates the effect of being randomized to a given treatment, no matter what else happened. So that includes adherence, poor adherence, or whether, feasibility was not so good for the intervention. That's part of the outcome. If the treatment is unpalatable, that's part of the expected outcome. And even though it doesn't tell you about the treatment per se, it tells you what happens if I offer treatment A versus treatment B to a given person. It includes dropout and unintended crossover. Next slide. Now, as I said, the drawbacks are that it doesn't really tell you whether the treatment works. If this is a medication study, if not every, if you had a lot of people who didn't actually take all the medicine, you don't really know whether the medicine, whether the pill worked or not. You only know whether you offered it, worked. So that's, a weakness. If you have a lot of missing data, it really takes a very experienced statistician to deal with that correctly, or at least as best as possible. Sometimes there's not much you can do. Let's just, next slide. So there's another animal called as treated or per protocol, so-called completers analysis. And you'll see this a lot in papers. They'll give you the ITT, but then they'll also say, okay, now we looked at people who really did participate to our satisfaction, had satisfactory participation and completion of the intervention. And intuitively, that seems like a really good idea, but the problem there is that it does spoil randomization. Now you have bias due to dropout or other, or side effects. You also have less power because you're throwing people out of the study if they didn't complete the analysis. There are some sophisticated models that allow us to do a little bit a better job than just throwing people out. We do have to define completers, but these are really sophisticated models, and I haven't seen much of them anywhere in the literature. Next slide. Okay, selecting endpoints. The norm now, if you're doing frequentist, and this is sort of, there's these sort of two schools that are arguing a lot lately. Frequentist, which is the sort of traditional statistics we do with p-values and inferential stuff that, based on Fisherian kind of statistics. But then there's also the Bayesians. Now, most of us are still doing Fisher's or frequentist statistics. And so the norm is to pre-specify just one or maybe two primary endpoints. We always pre-specify all our endpoints, but we want to make sure that we also correctly identify the hierarchy, that which are the primary, which are secondary, et cetera. Obviously, you want to pick the measure with the highest clinical relevance, most confidence in the validity and known sensitivity to the intervention. That's more a methods than a statistical issue. You also, as I said, you pre-specify your secondaries. And usually the power now, well, typically the power analysis is based on those endpoints. Unless you put a lot of focus on your secondary endpoints and your exploratories, usually it's sufficient for study sections to look at the power analysis and say, okay, you're powered for the primary endpoints. Next slide. Okay, so here are things that you shouldn't do. If you've already seen the data, don't switch endpoints after seeing the data. If endpoint A, depression scale, say, doesn't look so hot, but you had a secondary endpoint called maybe anxiety that looked really great, you can't really present the paper as if anxiety was your primary endpoint. And this happens a lot. Don't subset the enrolled patients, don't throw people out because they didn't look good for whatever reason. Don't change the follow-up interval. If you pre-specified that your endpoint was at 16 weeks or 12 weeks, that's the endpoint you report. You can report that, oh, hey, look, they look better at 18 weeks, but that's a subsidiary analysis. Don't remove one treatment arm from a design. I worked with a PI who wanted to do that. Don't fiddle with covariates. All covariates get pre-specified. Don't change cut points. If you're foolish enough to use any cut point at all, you certainly don't want to change them to find out which one looks better. And again, I say these things based on experience. People want to do these things. In fact, go to the next slide, please. There's actually a group that monitors this kind of fiddling. It's called comparetrials.org. And they actually go to the paper. They monitor four of the major journals. I think Lancet, BMJ, New England Journal, and JAMA. They look at a paper, they go online and they look at the SAP and they ask, how well does it match up? And as you can see, so far they've checked 67 trials. Only 9 had reports that matched their SAP. There were 354 outcomes that were specified in the SAP but never showed up in the paper. And remarkably, 357 outcomes across those 67 papers that just showed up out of nowhere. They weren't in the original, in the SAP. And maybe kind of depressing, then this group sends letters to the editor. Well, out of the 58 letters they sent pointing these problems out, only 18 ever got published. 32 were rejected, and there have been some very angry exchanges. But journals don't like to be told that that they've made that kind of mistake. Next. Okay, choosing the right model. This is pretty basic stuff. We know that it's the dependent variable that determines the probability form of the model. So if it's a how much, a quantitative or continuous variable, we know we can use general linear models or mixed models or generalized linear models if they're sort of as a funky distribution, a funny skew to the distribution. If the endpoint is a whether or which, we use logistic models or ordinal models if it's a true ordinal variable. And if it's whether, which, and when, we have time to event models. So these are all things that we've learned in grad school. Next slide. If you have a choice and you can find a nice quantitative or continuous dependent variable, this will be the best use of your limited resources. It will always have the most power compared to binary or time to event models. You're going to get a more precise estimate of the population value. It provides, the old thing about dichotomizing, it loses information. Well, continuous variables provide the most information. And they generally have better reliability than dichotomies. Next. Okay, so now you know your primary endpoints. You know we're going to try to maybe get a continuous variable as the primary endpoint. Here are your model choices, going from okay to most preferable. A t-test can be okay. You've randomized, and that's a reasonable, t-test can provide a reasonable bit of inference to which treatment did better. You can use repeated measures, classic repeated measures, ANOVA. Thank you, Naomi. And or modern mixed models. Can also use ANCOVA, where the difference score is the endpoint. But most preferable is just using the actual value of the post-treatment measure as the Y value, the outcome, and then covarying the pre-treatment value plus the treatment indicator plus covariates. That will give you the most power in almost all cases. Next slide. Let's see. And I'll just emphasize one thing on this slide. This is kind of redundant with the other one. This is directly, using the actual value answers the question that is addressed by the philosophy of a parallel groups trial. And that is, what will the groups look like after the treatment period? If I give a treatment A to a person versus treatment B, what will their score or condition look like at the end? Covariates really help by increasing precision and power. They also allow possible individual level prediction of an outcome. Next slide. This is just for your own reference. You can have a look at that paper. I have a URL for it, a link for it. This is the argument about why adjusted estimates are the best way or the preferred primary endpoint. Next. How do you choose covariates? Well, you don't look at the table 1 and look for imbalance. You select them based on whether they predict the endpoint. In linear models, covariates increase your precision and power, as I said. In nonlinear models, they also help, even though they inflate the standard error, reduce power a little bit. There's also this weird thing called collapsibility that biases unadjusted estimates toward the null. And so if you include covariates in a logistic regression or a Cox model, you'll actually have less bias toward the null. And as I said, focus on selecting variables that are strongly related to the endpoint. What predicts your endpoint? Don't worry nearly as much about baseline imbalance. That, I thought for years, and I think a lot of good statisticians really worried a lot about baseline imbalance. And I think in the last 10 years or so, enough people have worked on that problem to convince me, at least, that that is not a significant concern. I'll mention that again. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Pre-specify all your covariates, put them in the SAP, and don't fiddle, don't change. And of course, don't include mechanisms. If you think your intervention changes a coping skill, which in turn changes the endpoint, depression, say, you don't want to include the coping skill change in that primary model. Otherwise, you'll wipe out the effect of treatment in the model. Next. And here is just a little rant about covariate imbalance. And again, it was kind of a revelation to me, but there's been so much work about it. Here are some links you can look at. And the bottom line is, the argument is now we spend too much time looking at the point estimate. Here's the mean difference between the groups, when in fact the whole point of inferential statistics is to measure the uncertainty about that difference. And so we should be focusing on the CI, the confidence interval, and not the point estimate per se. Imbalance will move that endpoint or that point estimate around. imbalance between the treatment groups. But the imbalance comes out in the CI. More imbalance, the larger the CI occurs. And we reduce that imbalance, by including, any possible imbalance by including covariates. Next. Should I adjust for multiple tests? As I said, this is controversial. There is not a lot of agreement. The Bayesians are kind of laughing at the frequentists because they don't think they need to do any adjustment at all, because they don't rely on the same assumptions that frequentists do. But if you're going to be a frequentist, next slide. Maybe, maybe not. It depends. Maybe adjusting, maybe not. It depends. Next slide. And the summary idea here is that if you have a pre-specified hierarchy, here are my endpoints, my primary endpoints, here are my exploratory or secondaries. As long as you have those pre-specified with a strong hypothesis, I should say, this argument in that paper I showed earlier says you probably don't need to adjust. Of course, the Bayesians don't need to. Next. But if you don't have a pre-specified hierarchy, if it's just a, hey, maybe the treatment helped with this too, and you have a, kind of a passel of those, a list of things you're just interested in to see if something happened, then you'll probably auto adjust. Okay, next slide. And this is just a little more expanded version of that explanation. Next slide. So if you're going to do adjustment, say you do have a passel of secondary endpoints, why should you adjust? Next slide. Well, here's a sort of a fun exercise that Jerry Dalal came up with. These are screen caps. This is actually a live simulator. And so basically, he took random numbers and assigned them arbitrarily to one or two groups, each to one of two groups. And so in the population, they're random. There are no differences. But then he performed a t-test on them. I think he used like an N of 100, 50 in each group. Well, look, of the, say, I did 20 t-tests of my exploratory analyses. One came out by chance to be P is less than 0.05. Next slide. Oh, well, look, on a new spin of the dial, 2 came out. So again, we've gone in and we've made more random numbers and done 20 t-tests on them. Now 2 came out. Next slide. And sometimes we get tenure, a very publishable paper where all 4 of the 20 came out, and that's just gold. Again, all garbage, all completely random. Next slide. Okay, there are lots and lots of strategies for controlling false positives if you're going to do it. There are things like the gatekeeper strategy. There are, sort of alpha dividing control strategies. These are things that you should really just sit with your statistician and talk through. Some are easier than others. Some can be excessively complicated. Next. Okay, what should you do about missing data? For years, the defaults in commercial software were to throw out any cases that had a missing bit of data anywhere in the model. Dependent variable, independent variable, it would get thrown out. And that is still the default in SAS and I think SPSS. We know that introduces bias. And a few years later, maybe kind of in, I guess, the 90s and 2000s, there was an effort to do something called last observation carried forward. And basically what that was is if you had the endpoint missing for a person, you'd take whatever score you had for them last, and you'd make that the endpoint. Well, again, that's been thoroughly discredited as just as biased as listwise deletion. You still see it a lot in papers, and it just makes the results a lot less credible. The best practices are some form of multiple imputation. Again, here's why you need to work with a good statistician. Multiple imputation is a complex process. Yes, you may know how to run the SAS proc MI or something like that, but boy, there are so many ways to get bit and to be, things like outliers when you're doing the imputation, when you're doing the bootstraps or any of the recycling. There's also full information maximum likelihood that can be useful. Repeated measures can be really useful. We know that modern mixed models deal with missing data pretty well, but even now, the most recent literature still prefers, even if you are using mixed models, the most recent literature also recommends still doing imputation on top of what the mixed model is doing. Next. Now, in palliative care work, or really working with any population that's very ill or very debilitated, there's a relatively new approach called joint modeling. One of the big problems we have in palliative care work is dropout due, to person becoming too sick, or just it's too much of a burden to participate, or of course dying. And there have not been really good effective ways of dealing with this problem. This may be one way to do it. It's not well studied yet, but it has a lot of advocates, and it makes a pretty compelling case for a good choice of model. Next slide. The requirements for joint modeling, however, you have to have serial measures. If you have a continuous or a binary variable, you have to have it assessed over multiple endpoints. And then you also have an endpoint that's basically dropout or survival, or censored. And so you can see the upper part of this plot, the model generates, just like in a time to event, a Cox model, the model generates a hazard function. And then at the bottom, you have this longitudinal process out of a mixed model, and they actually inform one another. The hazard function informs, it actually tells you how much dropout has affected that longitudinal process, and vice versa. We can look at scores on the longitudinal process and see if it predicts dropout or death. I'm no expert in it, but and I don't think a lot of people are yet, but I think this is going to be a good way forward, particularly in palliative care. Next. Okay, so everybody wants to do moderation and mediation, in my experience, and that's fine. It's everybody's interested in mechanisms. Everybody's interested. Perfect, Naomi, thanks. Everybody's interested in whether there's a subgroup that it might be better served by the intervention than another. The correct test for moderation is to use an interaction term. Do not do splitting your groups and then comparing the treatment to the control within those groups. That is really just wrong with a capital W for all sorts of reasons. We still have even with doing it right with interaction, there's a danger of false positives. Sometimes the subset of the N is low and you can get wildly biased estimates. Next slide. And one sobering fact, you need about at least 4 times the sample size to have adequate power to detect an interaction. And that's under ideal conditions. If the interaction doesn't have the same effect size, if it has a smaller effect size, you just need incredible amounts of power in N. Next, just finishing up here, pretty much the same for mediation. I should add, moderation and mediation, of course, pre-specify. You have to show, what the moderators you're interested in are ahead of time. You can't just go fishing about. People still use the Barron and Kenny approach for mediation, and that paper now is 35 years old. There are much better modern approaches. Still requires larger sample size, and power analysis is very, very difficult. Okay, last couple of slides. So best practices are an ethical obligation. Pre-specify everything. Stick to your plan. Use covariates in the primary model. Use modern methods for missing data. Beware of the need for large samples in moderation and mediation, and stay humble. And one more slide. I'm retired as of last week. So this is my swan song, I guess. And so I'm going to rant for just 30 seconds. Don't use artificial cut points. I mentioned don't use within groups change as a primary measure of treatment. You shouldn't use percent change or ratios as an endpoint either. There's a nice literature on that. I have a lot of references of why that's bad idea. Stepwise automated selection, really yuck. That's a type 1 error nightmare. Oh, and finally, try to avoid using drop-down menu statistical software. It's a terrible, terrible thing in terms of replication or of reproducibility. We don't have a track record of what you actually did as an analysis that way. And if you can avoid Excel, especially, my God, for data entry, if you can avoid it, please do. But I do have a link at the end that says if you're forced to use Excel, here are some tips for making fewer errors. Okay, thanks. You can look at the rest of the slides. Twitter's great. I learned more on Twitter about statistics in the last 5 years than I probably did all through graduate school. There are a bunch of great blogs you can look at. A great discussion link up there too. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to serve as the moderator. What an excellent talk, and thank you so much for doing it while you're in retirement. It's really, really fantastic. So there were some questions in the Q&A, and I'll just go ahead and read them if that's okay.
Sure.
I'd really appreciate if you had a contact for the VA working group on improving statistical practice. Do you have a contact for that, Mike?
No, maybe they misheard. This is the APA, and it was 20 years ago.
Okay, gotcha. So you said, this is another one, that you shouldn't change covariates from your SAP. What are your thoughts on building models, for example, testing change in model fit when variables are added or removed?
Well, here's the price of that is that now your p-values don't mean the same thing. If you're going to do that, you should be doing a proper penalty. And there are approaches called penalization, where you have to pay a price for peaking and using the data to determine what the best model is. So I'm not, you're not going to go to hell after you die if you did it, but I'm just, you want to be transparent about what you did, and you want to do the proper adjustment when you do it. I'm a big fan of saying, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. Here's my model. It's transparent, it's written down, and here's what we found. And I know a couple of really good statisticians who make the argument and say, if you don't know what your covariates ought to be going into the trial, if you don't know what variables predict your endpoint outside of your intervention, you probably aren't ready to do the trial.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you so much. So here's another question. In terms of missing data, what are your recommendations for estimating missing items within patient-reported outcomes measures rather than missing the whole measure for a time point?
Well, it's interesting. I had a paper out with somebody just a few years ago, and we got into a big scrap with a review who argued that you should even use imputation. So if I understand, if you have missing items on an instrument.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. There were a few papers that showed that prorating, which is what's typical. So if you have only 8 out of 10 items, you basically just say, what's the mean of those 8
Yeah,
items,
sure.
those 2 empty ones in?
Right.
And I have to admit, you know, some things you don't keep up with properly, and I wasn't familiar with that literature that said imputation was better. And so I went back and did my own simulations, and I found that under most conditions, if you have a really robust scale that's unidimensional, you know, where everything is kind of correlated the same to the underlying dimension it's supposed to work or measure, that prorating is probably okay. The problem is that a lot of the scales we use, like the Beck depression inventory, they're not really unidimensional.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you can hear the thunder behind me. So if
I have thunder here too, which is I
Yeah,
keep
we're
looking
getting
like,
it.
oh,
yeah.
it looks like hail actually.
Yeah. So I guess the ideal is to use imputation even at the measurement model level. If you have a statistician who's good at slinging structural equations with measurement models, FIML, you know, full information with maximal likelihood, does a great job. As part of my simulations, when I was arguing with a reviewer, that's what I did. I showed that you get basically the same thing, at least with our data, thank God. So
Great. Thank you, Mike. So we have about 10 minutes, but I have to leave a tiny bit of time for Naomi. So the next question is, I worked with epidemiology colleagues who would use P as less than 0.20 for interactions. What do you think about that?
well, it is what it is. You know, what's one of the first things you ever learned about a p-value that then everybody forgets when they try to publish? You make your p-value a cost-benefit value.
Mhm.
If there's no downside to a false positive, use 0.5. You know, use 0.4. You know, if it's a cancer drug and I'm dying, you know, I'll take the 0.49 that favors the drug. So, you know, as long, again, I just think there just needs to be truth in reporting. We use 0.2. So then you'll get some people who say, well, that's, you know, I don't believe it, and that's fine. They don't have to believe it. But it's 0.2. You know, it's not as good as 0.05 or 0.001. So I don't have any kind of hard and fast hatred of the thing. And you know, in some cases, it's all you got because of the need for enormous sample sizes with interaction.
Thank you. So the next question is 2 questions on outcomes. One, if 2 outcomes are quality of life, for example, different measures of quality of life, how necessary is it to consider these different outcomes and consider adjusting for 2 primary outcomes? That's the first question.
That's a good question. You know, the issue, you know, you would assume they're going to be highly correlated.
Yeah.
And so there is a feeling that if you have 2 correlated outcomes, you should probably still adjust, but you should include that correlation in the adjustment. It's tricky. I don't tend to do it. I just pick one that I like a lot, you know, that I think is the one that people understand, that's most sensitive to change. And then I use the second one as what I think in the drug industry, they would call it a supportive analysis. Hey, look, I measured this again this way, and I still see the same thing. Another alternative is to average them. That may, you know, that's kind of your two structural equation latent variable. Now I'm getting the best of both worlds, you know, and just taking the average of 2 good measures.
Right.
So a more reliable measure of that.
That's good. And then can you please talk more about the Bayesian approach, especially related to outcomes?
I can't, you know, I'm retiring. I bought a couple of Teach Yourself Bayes statistics 2 years ago, and I know this much about it. I understand, you know, their approach is whereas, you know, frequentists, you know, we do null hypothesis testing. And so our question is, how odd is our result, assuming the null? They flip that around and they just say, you know, what's the likelihood that the data we see are true? And so you get a probability of the, you know, how true or how likely is it that the 2 millimeter difference I see in blood pressure is true in the population. So it's flipped around. I don't understand much about the philosophy of it. but I know if you go to that discourse forum that I have a link to, there are some wonderful and sometimes heated arguments and the Bayesians. But you'll read a lot. There are a couple of really dyed-in-the-wool Bayesians that really make a convincing. Yeah, that's in the thing. Rethinking Statistics. That's one of the ones I bought and never finished. That's a fantastic book on Bayesian statistics.
Thank you, Mike. So here's another question. When you use a continuous variable as an outcome, it's harder to explain the magnitude of the change compared to something like an odds ratio. For example,
it's not. Go ahead, finish.
So it says, how do you best explain trial outcomes involving continuous variables?
You should have a sense of what an effect size, what effect size matters. Effect sizes, standardized effect sizes are very straightforward. You don't even have to standardize them. If you're using a measure that's well known, like, again, I go back to what I have a lot of experience with, the Babyak and the Hamilton, most clinicians will tell you how many points they think matters. If they see a patient drop 4 points from, between weeks, they may behave differently. I usually ask, when I'm doing power analysis, I ask experts in the field, what's the difference in the original scale that will cause you to behave differently as a clinician?
Yeah.
So that I think it's easy. And if they don't have a sense of that, then I still, largely based on experience, I know that in behavioral interventions, if I get a third of a standard deviation difference between my treatment groups, I'm really doing something that a lot of people aren't doing. There to get something larger than that. And so, I know, that those are the sizes, those are the differences I tend to see. Odds ratios are nice, but they don't ever, it's never worth cutting that continuous variable to get an odds ratio because of all the information and power you've lost. There's a huge literature on this. So, statisticians have been begging for 60 years for people not to do this. The only reason people did it was because we had to do it by hand. We had to do continuous stuff by hand. It was a pain. So we made groups.
That's a good, thank you for the history. Yes. Okay, here's another question. For longitudinal models, hierarchical, multi-level models do have several benefits over, for example, ANCOVAs with pretest as covariate. They are more sophisticated and less well-known, but do you believe their greater accuracy are worth the greater complexity?
Well, my favorite approach with mixed models is to put the covariate, is to put the initial value as a covariate in those mixed models. Model the rest of the trajectory.
Yeah.
Now, there's a different interpretation for when everything's over on the dependent variable side. But there is, look, the power you by including the baseline measure of your endpoint is immense usually, because usually they're strongly correlated.
Oh, yes.
The more you shrink down that error term in your parameter estimate for treatment. And so it's, I do that. I put it in, I like mixed models because I can see, if I'm really interested in sort of the trajectory over time, maybe they're hitting a peak at an earlier time than I think, than my primary target date or target time. I get to see the process. Or is it worth it? No, not always. Sometimes there are a lot of ways to tweak, mixed models and a lot of decisions to make about covariance structure and all that. And, they're not easy to make all the time. I think this goes back to that principle of the APA task force, is use the simplest sufficient statistic. So if you're interested in trajectories, yeah, mixed models are going to help. But I would use the covariate, the pre-treatment level as a covariate.
Awesome. So you have about 20 seconds to answer this. Was the adjusting for the correlation prevent multiple collinearity? Does adjusting for the correlation?
Well, sort of. A p-value is it's a little different. Collinearity is a function of what happens in the model itself. You know, that when you have two strongly collinear predictors, all you care about is the collinearity. Collinearity is a function of the predictors in your
Yes.
model, the endpoints.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. It was so fantastic to hear from you. You are a wealth of knowledge and
Great to see
history. Enjoy
everybody.
your retirement and your music playing. We will miss you.
Thanks.
We should put the picture up of when we all had our PCRC mic. Oh, shoot. We should have that, Naomi. Okay, Naomi, it's yours. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you so much, Mike, for coming out of retirement, even though you weren't totally free yet. Thank you for coming back and having this talk for us, because I always learn something new and I always laugh. So thank you. And thank you to everyone else who's joined. If our attendees do go to our website, we have another webinar that's posted for August. And we actually have Dr. Frank Keefe presenting on how to respond to summary statements. So we hope you'll join us for that and learn something new as well. We will also be sending out an evaluation where we gather other topics that you might be interested in. So please take a minute to fill that out, and we'll take your thoughts into consideration. Again, another big thank you to Dr. Babyak and to all of our attendees for joining today. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.